Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on another really hot Wednesday. Today, we are talking about the Payables Agent. This is now part 4 of our AI webinar series, Doesn't Time Fly? And sort of in the middle now of our agent part of the series. So this is about automating AP in Business Central using the Payables Agent. My name is Robbie Goff. I'm a solutions alchemist at Together Vision Technology. No Paul Cartwright today. He is on a customer site. But we have Nikki Solly here. Nikki, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Nikki. I'm the Sales Exec Assistant here at TVT.
Lovely. Let's crack on and we'll get the boring stuff out of the way first, the housekeeping. Any questions? There is a Q&A panel, so please drop your questions in there. If you drop them in the chat by accident, it's all good. We'll get to them anyway, but please use the Q&A panel if you can. We'll pick the questions up as we go. If we run out of, if we can't do them as we go or they don't fit, then we'll just save them for the end. And any we can't do at the end, we'll pick up after the fact and send an email out. The session is being recorded. So slides, the recording and a Q&A summary if required will be sent out afterwards. So if you need to drop off or you've got colleagues that can't make it, no fear. A brief agenda sort of recap. Welcome introductions, obviously. We'll talk a little bit about the process of processing manual invoices, aka the quote-unquote problem that the Payables Agent is looking to solve or assist with. We'll then talk about what the Payables Agent is. We'll do a little demo. We'll try and do a live demo, always fun with software, particularly with agents, but I've got some Blue Peter, some stuff ready up my sleeve if we need to resort to that. We'll talk a bit about governance, the capabilities, the limits as well. We'll do a short section on pricing because this uses a different pricing model to standard Copilot functionality in BC. We'll then do a quick industry update, which was new as of the last webinar. So we've picked 4 headlines, 2 from the Microsoft world, I suppose, and 2 from the AI world more broadly to talk about. And then we've got 5 minutes for a Q&A at the end in the event that we don't get to the questions. Before we crack on, here's a recap of where we're at in terms of our AI webinars for Payables Agent. So the next one we've got is our custom agents in BC. After that, we'll start getting a bit more technical, I suppose. We'll look at some vibe coding pros and cons. We'll start looking at building our own copilots in AL, and then we'll look at MCP. Exciting stuff, but technical stuff. Microsoft have ruined our plan a little bit by releasing the expense agent. So there will be an expense agent special coming soon where we're just going to run through how it all works. Enjoy that little spinny animation I did. It's the only animation in the whole PowerPoint deck. Let's crack on by first talking about manual invoice processing, aka what does this process that the Payables Agent is looking to automate look like before agent? And specifically, it's processing emailed invoices. As is the case with the sales order agent as well, these agents are specifically about picking up documents by email. So I've broken this down into 6 steps. And this process broadly looks like this. We find the invoice. So an email is going to get sent with an invoice or invoices. If you're lucky, it's going to hit a shared mailbox, but it might also hit an employee's mailbox. It might hit several people's mailboxes. And already now we have maybe a little bit of confusion or work to do to figure out where these invoices have gone. Then we read it, obviously, and we pull out all the relevant information, vendor or supplier information, dates, line details, amounts, etc. And the next thing we're going to do is try to match the vendor. So crucially, we're going to say, is this a vendor we know? Is this a vendor we don't know? And then we need to figure out how to match that into a vendor record in Business Central. So already now you're sort of jumping between tabs quite a lot, your mail client, Business Central, etc. A lot of flitting back and forth. And the next 4, or I should say 3, 4, 5, and 6 in this process, these can all kind of go in different orders, and there's lots of forking and back and forth, etc. So probably what you're going to do is need to extract that information, specifically match descriptions to items or to GL accounts, amounts, etc. There's a fork here in the sense that it might be that your invoice has got orders or receipts in Business Central already, in which case you might want to match it to find that related order or receipt in BC, and from there create the purchase order using the action on the order page. But it might also be that those documents don't exist, and we need to create them manually. So you key it in manually. Essentially, this last bit, there's a lot of back and forth with extracting the information, potentially going back to the vendor and saying, you've invoiced me something wrong here. I can't make sense of this line. Which GL is this? Blah, blah, blah. Lots of back and forth, pretty time consuming, which sort of brings us on to the problem, which is rather dramatic phrasing, with manual invoice processing. Now, there are, of course, specific problems with manual invoice processing, as well as problems with manual file processing generally. So in terms of the AP specific downsides to this, your document is detached from your Business Central records. So you need to remember to attach that invoice to your BC records. Three-way matching is fairly easy to mess up by doing this all manually as well. But there's also some problems that are generic to, excuse me, manual document processing. And this is much like the sales order agent as well. The first, like we discussed, is that it is time consuming. We have to hunt for these invoices through multiple mailboxes. We have to do a lot of research in BC to match to GLs or to items. And then, of course, keying it all into the system by hand. And because of that, it's fairly error prone, quite easy to miskey these GL codes or these amounts or these vendor details. And once we've made those mistakes, fixing them is much more of a headache the further down the line we are. There's also a lot of back and forth, like we've said. Ideally, you have this best case scenario where the invoice comes in, everything on there is perfect. It's really easy to match in BC, but that's very often not the case. Back and forth emails required. A lot of mistakes can get made there. And this is an obvious one, but it doesn't scale. More volume means more headcount. It's a fairly linear trajectory in that sense, or it means that whoever is processing these invoices manually has to spend all of their time doing that instead of doing the other jobs they presumably have. And that is where the Payables Agent comes in, aka the solution. So what is it? Fundamentally, it is an agent inside BC that reads a mailbox, picks up invoice PDFs, it's only PDFs. It then attempts to code the lines from your own history or using some sort of semantic matching, and it then drafts a purchase invoice for review, and all of this is done automatically with some mandatory approval steps in there, I suppose, where it needs a user to say, okay, I'm happy with this, carry on. And crucially, it drafts the purchase invoice. There is no posting involved. And this is a theme you'll see in all of these agents, which is it considers something like the creation of a document, like a purchase invoice or a sales order, as a critically important action, which requires a human to approve. But posting is always out of the question, at least as of now, and I don't really see that changing. Some of the core tenets to this agent and agents generally. The first is that it reads these like a human. It uses Azure Document Intelligence, which is a form of optical character recognition or OCR, to pass important or key information from these invoices. It doesn't require a special format. So it could be formatted properly. It could be a bunch of scribbles on a PNG file or something like that. It's going to have a go at reading it regardless. Much like the sales order agent, it also navigates BC like a user. And there's some pros to this, there's some cons to this, but it's quite an interesting framework, the way that it essentially is clicking through lists, populating fields, clicking on action buttons, just like a user would. And it also keeps you in control. So as we said, it considers the creation of records high risk. Those are high risk actions, and those require human approval. So for all of those steps, someone has to confirm them or reject them. And there's also some extra mandatory steps you can add approval into as well. With all of that, we'll jump into the meat of this, which is looking at the agent in action. And we're going to look at a few different things, or 4 different things. We'll talk first about setup and config, which is actually fairly straightforward, especially relative to something like the sales order agent. We'll take a look at the happy path, which is we get an invoice from a vendor that we know that matches to a vendor record, and it's just going to create our purchase invoice nice and quick, is the hope. We'll then look at what happens when it picks up an invoice, but it can't match that invoice or the vendor on the invoice to a vendor record in BC, and what are our options when that happens. And then we'll look at how three-way matching works as well. So matching that invoice to an order and matching that to a receipt as well. So let's jump into BC. Here we go. And we're going to try and demo this all live. So I suppose demoing software is always fun, but demoing agents is particularly fun because these agents, as we discussed earlier on, they're basically navigating the UI like a user. And as a result, they're not the quickest things in the world. And that isn't a problem in production, really, because the invoice hits, you're not necessarily aware it's even landed in the mailbox. The agent picks it up and starts processing it and flags it to you. There is no crucial speed element most of the time. Where that does become important is during a demo when we're on a time schedule and I can't necessarily be waiting around forever, but we're going to give this a good go. So in the background here, I'm going to send 2 invoices to my mailbox, which you can see I've got open here. And whilst we wait for those to land, we're going to talk a bit about the setup and configuration for this agent. So the first place to go to enable this, and you might not even have to do this, is the Copilot and agent capabilities list. If you've come to some of these webinars already, you should be fairly familiar with this. This is your one-stop shop for activating all of your essentially AI functionality, or a lot of the AI functionality in BC. So it's split into 2 sections, which I find weirdly annoying. I wish they'd just put it into one: your production ready preview group and then a generally available group. And you'll find the payables agent in this bottom section in the generally available bit. It is probably active already, but if it's not, just select it and this will say activate and you just activate it. One thing I would draw your attention to here is the billing type, and we'll come back to how it gets billed at the end, but you'll notice that all of the Copilot functionality, the standard Copilot functionality, is down as not billed, aka it's included in your license. But anything agentic, so the agent design experience, aka custom agents, the expense agent, the payables agent, the sales order agent, these are all down as Microsoft build. And that's essentially telling you these use a different licensing model, which is Copilot credits. And we will talk about that a bit at the end. But in the meantime, up in my agent section in the top right, I might zoom in a little bit, which if you've got BC Online, you've probably seen this or are familiar with this. Any and all agents you've got, out of the box or custom, will appear in this top right section. So you can see here's a sales validation agent, which is a custom agent, deactivated, so it's white, but my sales order agent and my payables agent are both active, so they get that nice Business Central color. And I can see that I've actually got 2 things that need my attention here. So once this is activated, clicking on it will show you this panel. And what you get here is a tab for things that the agent is asking for your input on. And you can also see all of your recent files that have been picked up in the mailbox here as well. Before we pick those up, in fact, no, we're just going to, let's jump straight to, we're going to look at the config for the agent in a sec, but to get things moving, I'm going to approve these. So what this is essentially saying is, I have detected 2 PDF files in our inbox. Am I okay to start processing them? So I'm just going to go to review. And from here, I can view the email message, which is actually previewed in this body tab. I can also view the PDF from here. So you can do a sort of sense check here if you want. A very, very thorough invoice, that is. I'm going to say this all looks good and just say continue. And I will do the same with this one. And whilst these are being processed, let's take a look at the config. So if you select your Payables Agent tab, worth noting that you can actually hover over it and you get some nice information, the amount of emails received, invoices created, how much time it thinks it saved you, which is really interesting. You can then go to this little settings cog. And the config for the Payables Agent, as I said earlier on, are actually fairly straightforward. So you've got 2 pages. And on the first page, all you have is this active toggle and a cost bit, which will tell you how many credits have been consumed. Again, we'll talk more about what those credits mean towards the end. Something new, as of 28.3, is if you haven't used the payables agent and you're in a production environment, what you will see is the cost section will be down here, and on the top half of the screen will be something that says something like payables agent trial mode, and there will be a line that says 0 to 50 invoices processed. And that's because as of 28.3, it's tenant wide, but in a production environment, you get 50 invoices that you can process completely for free without having to set up any sort of billing plans or anything. And 50 invoices actually, to get to grips with an agent like this, is quite a lot. So if after the webinar you decide you want to have a play around and you don't want to pay for anything up front and you're on 28.3 BC Online, you can play around with this in trial mode. Really, really nice. If we jump to the second screen, this is where the rest of the config happens. I say the rest, like I said, not very much. Here we define our mailbox. So you define the email account and the folder. So the email account you can set up via this little drill down, but you can also just go to email accounts and set up an email there. This mailbox has to be one that your user has access to, clearly. And the folder, you can leave that blank, or you can specify a specific folder that you want it to look at. At the moment, I've just got this set to inbox, I guess. Then in document processing, you have two options here. The first is this review email checkbox. And what this means is, as you saw earlier, when an email hit my inbox with a PDF document, it nudged me and said, do you want me to start processing this? If you set that review email to false, it will skip that step entirely and it will just start processing it straight away. Pros and cons to both. I guess the idea is that if you untick that, then there is less human interaction. There's potentially less waiting around, because if a user forgets to accept or continue or approve those agent tasks, the invoices are going to just sit in the mailbox unprocessed. Whereas with this unticked, it can immediately start cracking on. Fantastic. The downside to that is, in terms of billing, you aren't billed until it starts processing the invoices. So if it picks up a PDF that isn't an invoice or is like a dodgy invoice or something like that, then with review email unticked, it's going to immediately start processing it. You're going to incur a cost, and it might end up being pointless because the invoice was fraudulent, or it wasn't even an invoice. It was some other PDF. So my suggestion really would be to leave this review email on. As we saw there, it just makes sense to use this step as a chance to do a bit of a sense check. So that's quite nice. You then have a configure additional fields, and we're going to leave this for the moment and come back to it a little bit later, because in the meantime, you can see that it is now processed both of those invoices. And I've got another little 2-bit indicating that it needs my attention for these 2 invoices again. Before we jump to it, there is one other place where there's some config and some setup for the agent. A little bit annoying that you have to do it in 2 places. If you search agents in your Tell Me, all of your agents appear in this list. So you can see I've got my 3 here. Any custom agents will also appear. And it's from here that we can configure 2 things, notably agent permissions and user access. So your agent is essentially a user in Business Central, and with that, it has permissions. So by default, your payables agent will have this payables AG run permission set, which allows it to do everything the payables agent does that we'll look at later, but that means reading and creating vendors, reading and creating purchase invoices, reading transaction history, et cetera, et cetera. But if you've got custom extensions or custom code that intercept any of that code somewhere and update some other table or run some other code unit that isn't in that permission set, here you can assign extra permission sets. I've given it the super user permission set. I would suggest not doing that, because giving an agent super user access is a bit of a recipe for disaster. I'm in a sandbox environment, so it's not the end of the world. But yeah, maybe don't do that in your production environments. Probably not best practice. What you've also got down here is this user access section. So the idea here is you will have one user, probably whoever activated the agent, that is essentially a super user. You'll have this can configure checkbox. But what you'll then want to do is add extra users to this user access piece, because when we get some tasks come through from the agent that require attention, by adding users to this user access bit, we allow multiple users to either approve or reject those agent tasks. So because I want more people to be able to review these tasks, I will then add more people to this user access tab. Hopefully that makes some sense. There's also some other fields here, stuff like the username, the profile that it uses, language, state, etc. But all of that is fairly self-explanatory. And the actual setup and config is actually fairly straightforward for the Payables agent. There was much more detail for the sales order agent, probably as a result of the Payables agent just not being quite as mature. But let's jump over to our needs attention section. So,
Robbie, we do have a few questions in the chat if you want
nice,
to
fire them
go through
over.
them. Does the agent detect when the same invoice has been resent?
It does, and we will come back to that a little bit later. Well, actually, we can probably address some of it now. If it detects an email with an invoice in and it's got the exact same file name and it's the exact same email, aka someone has accidentally sent it twice, it won't detect that as a duplicate. It will reprocess that file. Where it might detect it later is where it populates document numbers and things like that. And if that would, anything that would cause duplicate detection, if you were raising the purchase invoices as a user, the agent will do the same thing. So in that sense, it will detect the duplicates, but it won't detect them at the point that it begins processing the invoice. It will treat them all as unique files, I suppose.
The insights that pop up in the top left, are these tailored? Can you tailor them, or do they come as standard?
These come as standard. Nah, that's a really good question. I'm actually inclined to say no. Do you know what? Sorry, I'm jumping around a lot here. I don't think you can tailor these. The reason I was umming and ahhing there is because if you create a custom agent in code, you can control what this looks like. Whereas I'm guessing with the standard agents, you don't have control over that. It's actually a great question. So I'm guessing there, I don't think you can change this, but I will certainly be adding that to my list of things to test after this. It's a great question. Yeah, I'm inclined to say no, but maybe a more concrete answer after the webinar is done.
Oh, and then lastly, could you use this process to process inbound and outbound stock movements to different warehouses? So not for sales, but for stock movements for previously purchased goods?
No, and we'll come back to this. We'll come back to this a bit later as well. The scope of these agents is actually fairly rigid. So sales order agent and the payables agent, both the same. If we look at the payables agent, what we're fundamentally doing is reading emails. We are then trying to associate the invoice with a vendor and potentially creating a vendor and then drafting a purchase invoice. That is it. We can't mess around with that workflow. We can't remove steps. We can't add steps. I'll discuss why a little bit later towards the end of the presentation, just in terms of what the technical limitations are. But yeah, they're fairly rigid. To be honest with you, for me, these out-of-the-box agents are more about having a play, getting a feel for the sort of agentic framework in BC, and if they work and fit your process, perfect. But if they don't, that's where these custom agents come in, which is where you can basically build your own agent to do whatever you want. They can be as straightforward or as complicated as you want them to be. And oftentimes that's going to be a result of playing with the standard agents and going, these don't do what I need them to do. I need to do extra stuff. And actually, you can see up here, we have this sales validation agent as a good example. So no, the answer there would be custom agents. So it is possible, just not with standard.
Cool. And lastly, one's just popped in. You mentioned that the duplicate invoices would be processed and captured as duplicate later. Would this then incur a charge as the process has occurred?
It would, yes. I might, do you know what? I'll show you that now before we carry on. When a file or when a PDF is processed and this payables agent hits you with this needs attention, each one of these in BC is something called an agent task. So let's say you had an email with 3 invoices on. It's going to split each of those 3. What it actually does is it will create them all as incoming e-documents. So if I come to this incoming, in fact, let's go e-documents. If I come to this inbound e-documents, apologies, you'll see it creates each of these as an e-document, and it then creates each of those as an agent task. So if I go to my agent's task list, This is essentially, if I sort that by task ID, this is a list of every task for every single agent. So you can see that our payables agent is running, our sales order agent is running, and any of your custom agents. And if I scroll over a little bit, you will see the Copilot credits consumed by each of these. Earlier on, we got that, do you want me to start processing this invoice? At that point, no credits have been consumed whatsoever. The second I hit review, even if that is technically a duplicate invoice, you are paying for it. So yes, you are paying for it, unfortunately. By the time it catches that it's a duplicate, you've already incurred the cost. Any more questions?
I think that's all for now.
Beautiful. Okay, let's crack on with these invoices. Let's take a look at our first invoice first, which is our sort of happy path one. So I'm going to click on this. And what it's essentially told me, and actually, I might show you that agent tasks bit one more time. Let's sort this again. And for this one, we can see it's task 0121. And I just want to point out here, what this also does is it will show you stuff like, okay, when was this last updated? Who last worked on it? And what are the steps involved? And if we go on the steps done bit, we can see each of the steps the agent is taking as it literally navigates the UI. So you can see that it's found the invoice. Now it's invoking these actions. It's clicking an action, open e-document. It's clicking an action to analyze the PDF, which sends it off to Azure. So you can see each one of these steps represents an action the agent is taking in BC. And now it's sort of gone through all of this. It's created what we call a purchase document draft. So it doesn't create a purchase invoice, wait for our approval. It creates something called a purchase document draft. If we hit this review, here is what it's created. And once we're happy with this, we will hit continue, and that will then move on to create the purchase invoice. Some stuff to point out here. The first is we have this little view PDF action. So again, we can view the invoice PDF. We also have it in a fact box here, a little preview we can view. At the point we create the purchase invoice, it will automatically attach the file to the invoice record. So in terms of that audit trail, that traceability, all of that is done automatically, not something you have to think about doing yourself manually. We also have this view extracted data bit, which is really handy when we're debugging or trying to figure out what went wrong. This is effectively surfacing for you what the Azure invoice model picked up or processed. So these are all the fields it found, and it does the same with the lines as well. It shows you what it detected. It then attempts to match to a vendor. So you will see here that it has found a vendor. It's found 10,000 London Postmaster. And the way it does this, I was digging around the code actually, trying to figure out exactly how it does this. It has a process. The first thing it will do is try to identify a VAT registration number on the invoice and then match that to a vendor. If it can't do that, it will see if there is a GLN on the invoice, and then it will try to match that to a vendor. If it can't do those, it gets a bit fuzzier. It will then look for a vendor name, and it will try to match that. And that's a bit fuzzier and a bit more semantic, so it doesn't need to be an exact match. And if that doesn't work, it finally resorts to the address. So it will look at the address, city, postcode fields, try to find a matching vendor. What you'll see throughout is where it makes a stab at something and it isn't completely sure, it will throw this little I button. And I'll show you it in a minute, but when you click on that, it essentially gives you its reasoning and a confidence score. So if it's not sure about a field, it will tell you I'm not completely sure about this. But it's matched the vendor fairly easily. It's populated a bunch of other fields. It's pulled the document number here, document dates, due dates, etc. And if we look at our lines on our invoice, we had descriptions, but no GL accounts. Obviously, they wouldn't know what those are. And what it does here is it has a few different ways of coding or matching these lines, depending on whether it's an item or a GL account. One way it does it is by looking at the line description on the invoice, and it does some fuzzy or semantic matching and tries to match that to a GL account. So if the name or the description is very similar to the GL account description, it will use that to populate the number and it will explain its reasoning there. The other more interesting way and the smarter way of matching is via transaction history. So it will look at your unposted, posted purchase invoices, and it will search for similar descriptions on those it will look at the GL account you used and go, okay, well, they used this previously, therefore I'm going to assign it this time. And actually, if we look in this eye here and I click on that, here we can see that reasoning. I'm going to zoom in again because it is teeny tiny. And what it's done here is say, I have found a previous purchase invoice for mailroom or a line for mailroom from the same vendor, and it actually has the exact same description, and there's a consistent historical pattern, aka there's likely multiple posted purchase invoices with this description in it, and in each of these they used the GL account number 8450. And what we can even do is it gives you a nice little link to that posted purchase invoice. So I can see here that actually 20th of January, we had a posted PI with exactly the same descriptions. So it's found those GL accounts quite comfortably. And it's fairly likely that this does the same thing, exact description match and repeated historical purchases, and the same thing with this bottom one. What you will notice is it actually has it down as a low confidence. And this is where this sort of non-deterministic, fuzzy AI logic can bite you a little bit, because it doesn't specifically say why it has a low confidence. And what you could do is, or what I should say is, if you were to give this exact same invoice to the agent, each time its reasoning is going to be a little different because it's reasoning. It's not a deterministic answer. It's reasoning every single time, and it will generate you a new reason. And what's really funny is when I was testing this, for the bottom one, I actually got a low confidence again. And what it essentially said was, this description and this GL account historically belongs to posted purchase invoices that are posted roughly every month. Whereas the description on the actual invoice, if I go to the I, in fact, no, it's probably best if I go to my view PDF. And can I zoom here? Yes, I can. Lovely. That's too much. You will see here that my PO box and business redirection service, it's down as annual. So the best guess I've got is that because this line is down as annual, but historically it gets billed every month, it then has a low confidence. But that's only a guess. It doesn't exactly tell us why it has low confidence. Anyway, I've been waffling about the confidence stuff for too long. It also has matched our VAT prod posting group, and you'll notice that the I here isn't red because it's actually fairly confident about that. It's found a 20% VAT rate. Our vendor has got a business posting group of domestic. It's then found what it thinks is an appropriate VAT posting setup record and assigned that. It's done the same for our quantity. This pulled the unit price, line amount, and I should say, sorry, quantity from the invoice. That's all just fairly straightforward matching from invoice to purchase line or purchase document draft line. It does do some other types of matching. These are all GL accounts. If there are items on the invoice, it will do a more straightforward kind of matching where it's just going to look at it's going to do some inventory item matching. It's going to look at your item numbers. It's going to look at your item references, that kind of thing. That's all fairly straightforward. Very, very similar to how the sales order agent works. We've also got some extra fields down here: amounts, invoice discounts, currency codes, total VAT numbers, etc., etc. If we want to make changes to this, we can make changes to it. We can adjust all of these. We can add new lines. We can change the numbers, all of this stuff. We can even add new lines of different types. So when the agent creates these lines, it will only do lines of type GL account and item. It won't do resources or fixed assets or any of the others. But if you want to add those lines so that when you confirm they roll over to the purchase invoice, you can do so. But the agent won't do that automatically. So once we're happy with all of this, we're going to hit continue. And that is now giving the signal to the agent to create the purchase invoice. And we will use this as a good little break to talk about those custom fields that we saw on our payables agent and our settings cog. And if we go over one, we had this configure additional fields. And if we read this, it kind of summarizes what the purpose is. What it's going to do is it's going to use past invoice data to suggest fields for these new documents. So if I go on configure additional fields, These are a bunch of invoice line fields. And what it's essentially saying is, if you match or code a line based on historical transaction data, and that historical data has got these standard fields populated, VAT amount, net weight, job number, etc., or any custom fields were populated on those posted purchase invoice lines. So this can be stuff from custom extensions. If you select this consider additional field, then when it makes that match on historical data, it will carry those fields over to your purchase invoice. And as per Microsoft, I'm going to quote them verbatim, it's the way the generic purchase document draft experience supports fields from customizations, which is to say, if you want to populate custom fields on that drafted purchase invoice, this is the way you do it. It's not like the sales order agent where it will be smart and it will intelligently update custom fields if it finds those, if it thinks it can match them across. It doesn't do that. If you don't define them here, it won't do it, and it will only do it for historical data, and it will only do it for invoice line fields. So if you've got some sort of custom field on your purchase invoice header, your purchase header, it won't pull a custom field from your PDF to that invoice, if that makes sense. Essentially, it's just not quite as smart, the Payables agent, when it comes to custom fields. But as I've been waffling on about that, in the meantime, it has completed. So if I now select my completed agent task, we can see it's gone. The requested purchase invoice has been successfully created. And if I expand this task list a little bit, now I forget which one it is to click on. I think it's this finalized purchase draft. There we go. There's our purchase invoice. Bunch of information populated. Status is open. And here are my lines all populated. A lovely purchase invoice. And again, like I said earlier on, it's also attached the PDF to the file automatically. Lovely stuff. This now is where the process ends. It's not going to do any posting or anything like that. It just stops at the drafting the purchase invoice. Let's jump over to this second invoice we did. Now, this second scenario was where the vendor does not exist in the system, or at least we don't think it does. And you can see here it's now flagged that. The vendor could not be identified after searching for historical vendor matches. You can see there, like we said, it's using the VAT registration number, it's using address information, etc., and it's now saying, okay, what do I do? And this is something the agent is really good at. It will stop if it's not sure what to do, and that could be a break in the process, like not being able to identify vendor. It could also be that it gets some sort of error that it wasn't anticipating. It will ask you to step in. And you have two options here. You can either type instructions in for it, which is I'll talk about in a little bit, or it will give you some suggestions for something to do. And in this one, it's basically saying, I can just create the vendor for you if you want, using information from the purchase invoice. So we're going to go create vendor and go continue. Now, regarding those custom instructions, those are quite good if it hits an error and you need to give it some sort of advice so it can attempt to work around the error. But it's not always fantastic, those custom instructions. I'm trying to think of a diplomatic way of saying that I don't think those custom instructions are basically very good. Earlier on, I attempted to tell it, actually, the vendor you're meant to be matching with is this one, and give it a little nudge and essentially say, use this existing vendor. And it completely ignored me. So those custom instructions are not awesome. But what that is now done, if we jump to our vendor list, the vendor on the invoice was, I believe, called Thornbury. And what it's done here is create that vendor. Now, much like the invoice itself, if there's a bunch of vendor information on that invoice, hundreds and hundreds of fields, I doubt there would be, but if there was, it's not going to map those to every single other field on the vendor card or custom fields. It's essentially going to populate the same fields every time. And that's going to be stuff like the name, stuff like the address. Anything beyond that, it's not going to pick up. I tested this. I popped an AWRS URN on an invoice in the vendor section. And I said, okay, create the vendor by scratch. And it did not map those across. And essentially, that's because the Azure invoice model that it uses to read the invoice, it's a pre-built one. It doesn't pick up custom fields as far as I can tell. So it's only going to populate the bare minimum on that vendor. The idea is you would come in and make those changes to the vendor after the fact. Now that's done, it's telling us, okay, the new vendor record has been created. Can you review it? And I'm going to say, yeah, that all looks good. And now it's going to run off and create the invoice. And I may come back to that shortly because the astute among you might have noticed a field on that vendor record, which is going to probably cause problems. The final one we're going to look at is our three-way matching. And this is where I'm going to do a Blue Peter and just jump to what I did earlier. So we sent over an invoice, and our invoices may include references to purchase orders or a purchase order number, but it also might not. And in this scenario, it has detected a purchase order number on the invoice, namely PO 000516. And because of that, it's then searched our list of purchase orders. It's found it. What it has then done is searched for the purchase lines on that order which have not already been matched to an invoice. It's then attempted to match the item numbers to those lines. And if it's happy, it will essentially match those to the purchase lines on the purchase order. So you can see here that it's added two new columns, this order line match column and this order match warnings. So it's successfully found the purchase order. If I click on this, I can see that there is a historical, or an open, I should say, purchase order with three item lines and a GL account line, which corresponds perfectly to our invoice. And it's thrown no warnings here. And if I go to my order matching tab, which we didn't have or look at earlier on, we now have this open matched order piece, which will do the same thing we just did by clicking on that order line match bit. It's also got an open matched receipt. So as well as matching it to an order, it's then said, okay, are there any lines on that order that have been received that I can match it to? Or it's said, okay, let me look for purchase receipt records associated with that purchase order. And then it does the same checks. It looks for lines that are not already associated to a purchase invoice line, where the type and the no match, aka the item number or the GL account number, and it then associates it with a purchase receipt. So here I can go to open match receipt, and you can see this is a perfect posted purchase receipt with those three items and that GL account. So it's matched those really nicely. In the event that the invoice does not have a purchase order number, it still might try and do some order and receipt matching. What it will do is instead say, okay, I've got a bunch of lines here and I've got a vendor number. So I'm going to look for all of my purchase order lines where the vendor number matches and where, again, the invoice, they are not already matched to an invoice line. So it's going to do a bit of a fuzzier detection. And if it finds an order where the number isn't even on the invoice, but the lines do match, it's going to go, okay, I think this is probably the right order. It's going to match them, and then it's going to give us our reasoning. It's going to give us a confidence score. In the event that it's assigned it to the incorrect order or the incorrect receipt, we can hit remove match, and we can then ourselves manually match them to an order line or a receipt line. Really bothers me that this uses different terminology, match then specify. Maybe that's an AP thing, I don't know. But I would be able to select a line, go to match to order line, and what that's then going to do is give you a list, again, using that filter criteria we spoke about, which is I'm going to look for all open lines for that vendor that are not already associated with an invoice, and we can match them that way. Same with the receipt. Funny thing to point out here, if it thinks there's a problem in some way, it's going to raise it in this order match warnings one. So a really classic example is maybe we receive an invoice that hasn't been, where the lines have not been received yet. So in that case, it would flag that here. This, I think, in the interest of transparency and openness, I think this is actually a bug in the Payables agent. Here it's saying the invoice quantity, 12, exceeds what is missing to invoice from the order by 11. It's essentially saying the order says that you only need to receive 1, but you're telling me it's 12. And I actually think that's because of these pesky unit of measures. There's some sort of conversion that's being done incorrectly here. So I'm pretty sure that's a bug, which we don't love. But there you go. That is the nature of new functionality and new features. Fortunately, I have raised it, so hopefully they fix that fairly soon. That was an extreme whistle-stop tour of the Payables agent. And there's maybe one more thing to point out, actually, which is if we jump up here and we look at this review and we review the purchase document draft it's created, and I'm going to say continue, we should see an error, and we're a little bit low on time, so I'm not sure I'm going to wait for that error to flag. But the error we're probably going to get is if we go to that vendor that it created, this was the second one where it didn't recognize the vendor. Here we go, and let's search for it. Thornbury, if it does it. So you may have noticed this previously, but the blocked field, when it creates a vendor, gets set to all. So the idea is that between the creation of the vendor and the creation of the purchase invoice, someone needs to come in, review the vendor information, and unblock it. And if they don't, and what great timing that was, if I come over here, it is saying I can't create the purchase invoice because the vendor I created is still down as blocked. So please sort this. So if you forget to do it, which I have done in the process of preparing for this, it will flag that with you. So this is the point at which you would come into your vendor, review it, unblock it, you would hit review and continue, and it will then successfully create the purchase invoice. And I'm repeating myself, but that was our whistle-stop tour of the Payables agent. Lots and lots of stuff covered there, I appreciate. Let's jump back to the PowerPoint. And let's do a little, we've got about 12 minutes left, and we're going to talk a bit about governance and capabilities and limits. And a lot of this is just a sort of recap, to be honest. In terms of governance, here I'm talking about where do the humans stay in the loop? What's mandatory? What is optional? So the mandatory stuff, or the optional stuff I should start off with, is the incoming email. So we spoke about this. In the config, you have the option to say, when an email comes in with a PDF, do I want that to automatically get processed? And as we've spoken about, and as one of the questions hinted at, incur a cost immediately, or do we want that human review in place where someone just comes in, sense checks it, says all good, and then lets the agent process it? Again, opinion-wise, I would suggest leaving this as yes, as leaving the review on. Then when it comes to creating the new vendor, if it thinks it needs to create a new vendor, there's a mandatory block there, which is it's going to set that block field to all. A human has to come in and unblock it themselves. You can't skip this bit. There's no config to say you want to skip this bit. It's mandatory. The finalization of the draft, again, this is considered a critical task by Microsoft. So it's going to create that purchase document draft for you, but at the point it needs to move it to a purchase invoice, a user has to come in, review it, and say continue for it to do so. And as we also mentioned, when it comes to any uncertainty or it hits any errors, the agent will stop and ask you. And I put on demand here because this is fluid, it's dynamic. It will just do this as and when it thinks it needs to. One thing I would mention here, and this is kind of speculative, I was digging around all the code as part of the prep for this webinar, and I found some stuff, some setup tables that I could not find visible in the UI in BC. And interestingly, it looked to be something like vendor configuration records. So a question some of you might have is, well, can we have different configuration governance rules per vendor? And at the moment, the answer is no. But having dug around that code, I suspect that's coming, but don't take my word for it. I might have misunderstood those objects, but it does look like there's some sort of vendor level governance or rules that we can define somewhere in the future, hopefully. That would be really, really nice. A bit of a recap of where the boundaries are and the capabilities and the limits, etc. Because I've sort of isolated these as the things that I think are either gonna, not either, that I think might block you from using this if you have thoughts of using this. So I'd rather just put them here and we can rule them out now. So the first, this is a fixed workflow. As I said in answer to one of the questions earlier on, email comes in, we try to match it to a vendor and we create it if there isn't one. The invoice gets created, that's it. We can't reorder it. We can't tell the agent that we never wanted to create the vendors. We can't post the invoice. We can't create orders or receipts or anything like that. We are fixed in place. And the reason for that from a technical perspective is because there is a set of core AI instructions that the agent has, and we can't mess around with those. We actually can't even see them. They're hidden from us. When you create your own custom agent, you define these instructions yourself. What they essentially are is a big natural language Word document which says you are an agent whose job is to do X, Y, Z, and then a big list of instructions. We can't mess around with this. So that's why we can't modify that workflow. And the other really big blocker, I suppose, if this is something you wanted to use, is that it is email only, as I discussed near the beginning. So if you have EDI or you use PayPal or a web portal, this isn't going to work for that. This is for email only. That's not to say that in the future they won't introduce other methods of processing these invoices, but for the time being, it is email only. But fear not, because as I also said earlier on, if you need more flexibility, whether that is an agent which does a completely new process, or maybe it's an agent which does a very similar thing to the payables agent, but with extra steps or modifications, you can do this using custom agents. And we are doing a webinar on that in just under a month on the 26th of August. I say this every webinar. I love these custom agents. We love these custom agents. They're really, really cool. So if you're looking at this and thinking, oh, I wish I could use this payables agent, but then custom agents is probably the answer. And then a very brief recap of stuff it can and can't do. There were some sort of gotchas that we didn't mention. So it can read PDF invoices, but, and this might be another blocker, what it can't do is handle non-PDF invoices. It also can't handle emails that have over 10 PDFs on. It doesn't even error. It just completely ignores them like they weren't even there. And then probably most critically, it can't process PDFs over 10 pages. This, probably more than anything else, is likely to be a blocker because we've seen before a bunch of times PDFs, 50, 60 pages, big old PDFs. It isn't going to be able to process these. Now, the sales order agent used to have this limitation, and recently they upped the amount of pages that it can process. I want to say it's 40. It could be 50. I suspect that will come to the payables agent at some point, but for the moment, you are limited to 10 pages. It can identify vendors and create new vendors, as we've discussed, but it can only create them as unblocked. So if you're looking for a quicker approach where it just creates the vendors for you, it then just creates the purchase invoice with minimal user interaction, that isn't the case here. It will create them as unblocked. It can code these lines based on your transaction history, as we saw earlier on, and historical data. Really, really smart and really, really clever. But that's sort of where it ends. It ends at that creation of the purchase invoice. It can't post or pay anything. Again, a really common theme across these agents. Not with custom agents, though. You could post stuff with custom agents. And finally, it can do three-way matching, invoices, orders, receipts. I actually think the Microsoft documentation is behind here, and it says that it's still coming, but you can do that at the moment, right now, as of 28.3. But it doesn't, as we've discussed, detect duplicates on the way in. It also won't flag any serious anomalies or anything it considers to be fraudulent to you. As part of that processing model in Azure, it's not there to detect dodgy stuff. That is why these sense checks are so critical, particularly at the point that the invoice gets picked up by the agent. That's the point at which someone who knows what they're doing needs to come in and say, does this look good? Does this look dodgy? Approve, reject, etc. Finally, pricing. Blissfully a little bit more straightforward than the sales order agent. As I discussed, this has a different pricing model, so it uses Copilot credits. What is a Copilot credit? A Copilot credit costs 1 cent. I've not given the pence breakdown there because it would be some silly decimal. And this is how it bills it. Again, way more straightforward than the sales order agent. It is essentially per invoice, the header notably, it's 50 tokens, which is 50 cents, and you then incur a 5-cent cost per line. For non-invoice or skipped emails, aka what I was saying earlier on, where it gets to that review process point and we say don't process it, there is no cost. The cost is incurred at the point that you ask it to process the invoice. And again, as of 28.3, you do get 50 invoices free now, assuming you haven't tried it out in a production environment before. and a really simple breakdown there. If you've got an average 3-line invoice, which would be great, wouldn't it? You're going to look at about 65 credits. And per month, if you're processing about 100 invoices a month at 3 lines, you're looking at about $65 a month. Worth mentioning here that in terms of Copilot credit plans, there is a pay-as-you-go plan and there is a prepaid plan. And obviously, the prepaid plan ends up being quite a bit cheaper, actually, and you can see the breakdown of costs there. And that's the only plan for it. There's no extra license costs. There's no initiation fees. You just buy them using these sort of capacity or consumption plans, and you're off. And with that, we are done talking about the Payables Agent. I'm going to spend probably 3 minutes now doing a real brief recap of industry news. If you want to stay and listen to that, fantastic. If you don't, I hope you've enjoyed the webinar or found it in any way useful. If you've got any questions, please ping them in the Q&A section of the chat or just send them over via email. Yeah, let's spend a couple of minutes just looking at some news. And again, I've broken this down into 2 kind of Microsofty things and 2 bigger picture things. The first is agents have been getting lots of updates, and this is as part of 28.3. So probably most crucially, the expense agent, which we spoke about in our last webinar, and we also spoke about at the beginning of the session, that should be with most of you now. That should be in your environment as of 28.3. Again, there will be a webinar to come on that. It's probably going to be in the next 2 to 4 weeks, but don't take my word for that. But it will be coming. Microsoft have also made some updates to the sales order agent. So the big news is they've made this multi-agent. So previously, you could only have 1 sales order agent per company. And the limitation there was that means it can only look at 1 mailbox. And it also meant that if you have different sales functions or teams that have different governance rules or need different requirements or approvals or anything like that, you couldn't support that. It was 1 sales order agent with 1 set of governance, and that was it, and 1 mailbox. Now you can have a bunch of agents in a single company, all of them pointing at different mailboxes, all with different optional review steps, which is really, really nice. They've also improved the item matching functionality. I've not had to dig around to figure out exactly how it's been improved, but there is more item semantic matching effectively. I need to have a little mess around with it. And again, they've also updated the amount of pages in a file that it can process. It used to be 10 like the Payables Agent. They've upped it to something like 40. So fingers crossed that's going to come to the Payables Agent soon as well. And they also then made that change to the Payables Agent to allow for 53 invoices, which I think I've now said about 10 times this webinar, and that'll be the last time I say it. I am excited about it though. The other Microsofty news is GPT 5.6 is now the default in Copilot. So this is OpenAI's new model that is now the standard in Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Chat, Co-work. Notably not Business Central just yet. Business Central tends to be a little bit behind the curve on this. I think we got 5.3 or 5.4 in May or June or something like that. So we're probably looking at October for when that gets rolled out. And that just means that the agents are going to keep getting better, which is nice and really, really fun. Into non-Microsoft news, Kimi K3 got released. This is big news and interesting in the AI world because it's the largest open weight model yet. So it's huge and it's capable and it's controversial and it's open. And for those of you that don't know what this open weight model means, it essentially means that you can download this and run it on your own hardware. And you can also fine tune it and essentially train it on your business data. So it means that a business could run this model inside their own network, trained on their own data without having to use or subscribe to something like, a Claude or an OpenAI subscription, or use like an OpenAI endpoint in Azure or something. You can host it all completely yourself, which is huge for regulated industries, legal, defense, healthcare, that sort of thing. And there's obviously a political element to this because it's this sort of democratized AI approach from China versus America's companies, who increasingly the government is getting involved in sort of blocking access for retail users to a lot of these models. So a really interesting story developing there. And then ending on something boring, which is the EU AI Act. I say it's boring. It's not really boring. On the 2nd of August, they're introducing something called Article 50 in the EU AI Act, which means that chatbots must declare themselves as being chatbots, and AI-generated content must declare itself as being machine-generated or AI-generated. And this is a bit of a precursor of things to come. There will be some much heavier things coming, probably towards the end of the year, certainly towards the end of 2027. What is being discussed is things like mandatory registration in EU databases, mandatory risk management systems around AI, mandatory logging, mandatory nominated responsible owners, and that kinds of stuff. So the regulation is coming. And with that, we are done. I don't know if there are any questions that we haven't answered yet. If so, let's look at them now.
There is quite a few, but I think with time, it's probably best to respond to those in the chat.
Cool. In that case, then we will either respond to it in the chat or we'll pop answers into a document or something and email them out to everyone. If you have any more in the meantime, or you just want to chat about this stuff, please just ping me or Paul. Can't write an email. I cannot stress enough how much we love talking about this stuff. So please, any sort of conversation you want to have, just give us a shout. We love it. With that, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your days, and we will see you next time.